broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
The webinar will begin in 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Patricia Barton, and I'm the Consortium Coordinator. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, looking at Latino families' access to early care and education through multiple dimensions. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to say a few words about the consortium and about using GoToWebinar. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of more than 25 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. First, to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and to facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. Second, to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And third, to foster effective translation between research, practice, and policy audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you're interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on this slide. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we are using today. We are using GoToWebinar to host this webinar. All of the attendees are muted. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the question box on your screen to submit them, and we will try to get to as many questions during the Q&A at the end as possible. Today's webinar will be recorded. After it ends, it will be uploaded to SRCD's YouTube channel, and I will share that link with all registrants. Please feel free to share that link widely as well. And now I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Michael Lopez to introduce today's topic and speakers.
Thanks, Patricia, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, looking at Latino families' access to early care and education through multiple dimensions. This webinar is part of our efforts at the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families to build capacity within the field to better serve Latino communities throughout the country. Today, we'll be sharing key policy-relevant findings from a series of studies that have examined important factors influencing Latino families' access to ECE. Things such as search and decision-making processes, parental preferences, flexibility of hours, among other factors. We'd like to thank our collaborative partners for this event, the Society for Research in Child Development and the University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium. Also, throughout the webinar, we'll be live tweeting. Please feel free to tweet and follow our Twitter chat. We have a number of speakers, so I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce them. First up is myself, Michael Lopez. I'm co-principal investigator of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. Lina Guzman is a director of Child Trends Hispanic Institute and the co-principal investigator of the Hispanic Center, my partner in crime. Next up is Danielle Crosby, who is co-investigator at the Hispanic Center and an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Finally, we're happy to have our discussant, Yvette Sanchez-Fuentes, to provide some perspective on the policy implications of this work. Yvette is Deputy Chief of Public Policy at Childcare Aware of America and former Director of the Office of Head Start within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Now, just a few words about the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. The center was founded in 2013 through a cooperative agreement from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the Department of Health and Human Services. Its mission is to conduct research and provide research-based information to help inform programs and policies supporting Hispanic families and children around three programmatic areas of interest: poverty and self-sufficiency, healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood, and early care and education, focus of today's webinar. Because we aim to inform program and policies, our research focuses on low-income Hispanics. In addition to conducting research, we also fulfill this mission through building capacity activities including building the pipeline of emerging scholars who focus their work in this area and providing tools and resources to the field, such as today's webinar. We also provide strategic dissemination and outreach, making sure that the research gets into the hands of those who can use it. The Center represents a collaborative partnership among a team of research and academic organizations, including Child Trends and App Associates, along with 3 universities, NYU, University of Maryland, and UNC Greensboro, as well as our federal partner, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within ACF. Just a quick note that the views expressed here represent those of the Center and not the views of the federal government. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lina Guzman, who's going to share the first set of highlights from our work examining key dimensions associated with Latino Families ECE Access. Lina.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we get into the meat of our discussion, I wanted to say a few words about why we focus on Latino children. And to help answer that question, I'd like to share 4 facts. The first is that today, roughly 1 in 4 of all children in the US are Hispanic. The second is that economic security is precarious for many Hispanic children. Roughly a third live in poverty. Third, the vast majority, over 90% of Hispanic children in this country are US born. And fourth, although the vast majority of Latino children are US born, the immigrant experience is a reality for many. As work that we released last year shows, 1 in 4 of Latino children has a parent who lacks legal status. So as we think about our programs and policies and how best to support Latino families and children, it's important that we think about their incredible diversity and experiences. So now let's turn to the topic of today's webinar, looking at Hispanic families' access to early care and education through multiple dimensions. During the last 4.5 years, the Hispanic Center, as well as others, have been working to better understand Hispanic families' access to early care and education programs. This work reflects in part an increase in public investment in ECE, as well as a growing recognition that to understand families' access to early care and education, we must consider more than just the number of slots or what families are using. Our work has also been informed by a recent framework for understanding ECE access released by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. In that framework, they note that access to early care and education means that parents with reasonable effort and affordability can enroll their child in an arrangement that supports the child's development and meets the parent's needs. So as you can see, implicit in our OPRE's definition is the notion that access to ECE is multidimensional, including reasonable effort, affordability, and so forth. And just as a note, when we use the term early care and education, or ECE, we're referring to public pre-K, Head Start, community-based centers, as well as home-based providers. So today we're going to be sharing highlights of our work that has looked at these multiple dimensions that we believe collectively allow us to better understand the experiences of Latino families. Our work falls into 2 broad categories. As you can see here on the left-hand side, are household behaviors or characteristics that shape access, including utilization patterns, parental needs and preferences, and search and decision-making. And on the right-hand side, you can see various aspects of supply, for example, flexibility and availability, predictors of quality, and workforce diversity. We'll be coming back to these dimensions throughout the presentation. The work that we're going to be highlighting today draws from the National Survey of Early Care and Education, also known as the NSECE, which is a set of 4 integrated nationally representative surveys that describe the ECE landscape in the US. For the first half of the presentation, Danielle is going to be drawing on data from the Household Survey, which is a nationally representative sample of households with children under the age of 13. And for the second half, when I talk about the supply of ECE, or the features of the supply of ECE, I'll be drawing from data from the center-based survey, the home-based survey, which includes a nationally representative survey of formal and informal home-based providers, and the workforce survey, which includes a nationally representative survey of center classroom staff. Throughout the presentation, we'll be providing a descriptive portrait of ECE access and provide comparisons of the experiences of low-income Hispanic families to their white and Black peers, or to the characteristics of high Hispanic serving providers to that of their low Hispanic serving counterparts. While not reflected in today's presentation, our work has also used data from local areas such as Chicago and Miami, and the findings using local data reinforces the national snapshot that we'll be presenting today. All of this work and other work from the center can be accessed at our website that is located, shown here at the top of the page. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle. Danielle?
Thank you, Lina. Yes, thank you. And hello, everyone. As Lina mentioned, I'm going to share with you some of what we've been learning about ECE access for Hispanic families from a household perspective, focusing on the 4 dimensions shown here. Before providing detailed findings related to each of these dimensions, I'd like to preview a few of the highlights. So interestingly, much of what we're finding challenges commonly held assumptions about Hispanic families. Earlier studies with older data have found lower rates of ECE for Hispanic children compared to their non-Hispanic peers, a gap that has often been attributed to culturally based preferences. However, our results suggest that utilization patterns may be changing. So nationally, we find higher rates of ECE participation than previously estimated. And we're also finding more similarities than differences in the types of ECE settings being used by low-income Hispanics compared to low-income white and Black families. Similarly, within National Parent Report data, we find little evidence of a preference among Latinos for home-based care. And when Latino parents search for ECE, they report being as likely to consider center care for their preschool-aged children as white and Black parents. So let's take a closer look now at some of the data behind these findings. I'm going to begin by showing you some highlights from our work on ECE utilization. And this is one of our starting points at the center in terms of thinking about access. We wanted to use contemporary national data from the NSECE to describe the care arrangements currently being used by low-income Hispanic families and consider how utilization might vary by factors such as household nativity and child age. So to show you one of our findings, in this first figure, we have here the percentage of children who experience any non-parental care arrangement on a regular basis. And on the left-hand side of the graph, the teal and the orange bars represent Hispanic children in immigrant and non-immigrant households, respectively. And what we find is that approximately half of young Hispanic children in low-income households are in some type of childcare or early education program, with somewhat lower participation rates for those in immigrant versus U.S.-born households. Comparison data for white and Black peers are shown on the right-hand side of the graph. However, before talking about differences by race and ethnicity, let me show you these findings further broken down by child age, because the results differ depending on whether we're talking about infants and toddlers or preschool-aged children. So when we examine ECE participation by child age, we're finding smaller differences by race and ethnicity for older versus younger children. So for this first set of bars being shown for children between the ages of 3 and 5, we find that a majority of Hispanic children from both immigrant and U.S.-born households are in child care arrangements, which means they're as likely as their white peers to be in ECE, though somewhat less likely to be so than their Black peers. Now, when we look at infants and toddlers birth to age 2, first, we see lower rates of ECE than for preschoolers across all groups, but we also find some additional gaps between Hispanics and their white and Black peers. So looking at the light teal bar, we find that just over 1/3 of Hispanic infants and toddlers from immigrant households are in childcare, which is significantly lower than for their same age white and Black peers, shown in the light gold and the light purple bars. Infants and toddlers in U.S.-born Hispanic households, however, so represented by the light orange bar, have similar rates of participation as their white peers, but lower rates when compared to Black peers. We've also conducted similar analyses looking at the type of care to get a sense of how many Hispanic children are experiencing center and home-based arrangements and how rates compare to those for white and Black children. What we find counters the narrative that has existed that Hispanic families are less likely than other racial ethnic groups to access center-based care. Among low-income children who are participating in ECE, we find that Hispanic children are generally no less likely to be attending center programs than their same age white and Black peers, especially among preschool-aged children. The only statistically significant group difference here is that Hispanic infants and toddlers in U.S.-born households, so the light orange bar, are less likely than Black infants and toddlers, shown in the light purple bar, to be in center-based care. Similarly, we find no group differences by race and ethnicity or household nativity in the use of home-based care arrangements. In other words, Hispanic children are as likely as their same-age white and Black peers to be in home-based care. Furthermore, in results that aren't shown here, we look at more specific types of home-based care based on the familiarity of the provider and whether it's a paid arrangement. And we find that Hispanic children in immigrant homes are less likely than their peers to be in unpaid family friend care, and they're more likely to be in paid home-based care with an unfamiliar provider, which was somewhat of a surprising result to us. So although documenting utilization patterns has been an important aspect of our work at the center, it's certainly only a starting point, as I mentioned a moment ago, because given our multidimensional view of access and the opportunities afforded by the rather comprehensive ECE data set, we've also been looking at such factors as parental needs. The timing and predictability of parents' work hours is one example of a need that has implications for when and where children spend time in care and which ECE options families are able to access. So we've been taking advantage of the detailed calendar data in the NSECE to examine the work schedules of low-income Hispanic parents with children younger than age 6. And some highlights of this work are that parental work during non-standard hours is a common experience for young children in low-income households. We find that most Hispanic children with working parents have at least one parent who works non-standard hours. And more specifically, we find that early morning hours, evening work hours, and weekend work hours are pretty common, impacting from 30 to 65% of Hispanic children with working parents. On the other hand, we find that overnight work hours are rare. We also find that half of low-income working Hispanic parents report having very short advance notice, so 1 week or less of their work hours, which, as you might imagine, can create challenges for scheduling childcare and establishing and maintaining family routines. So together, these findings hint at some of the scheduling issues that low-income Hispanic parents likely face in coordinating work and care for young children. We know from other research that this is a reality for many low-income families, not just Hispanic families, but we also found in our analyses two exceptions to this pattern in terms of cross-group comparisons. So first, we find that Hispanic parents are more likely to face short advance notice of work hours than low-income white parents. And the rates of this are highest in immigrant Hispanic households. Second, we also find that Hispanic children in immigrant households are more likely than their peers to have a parent who works weekend hours. In addition to the household needs that may influence access, parents' preferences for the types of ECE settings and experiences they would like to provide their children are important to consider, and the NSECE data also offer insight in this area. Within the household survey, parents were asked to rate how well they believed 3 types of ECE settings provided for children along 6 dimensions: educational preparedness, social interactions, nurturing, safety, affordability, and flexibility. And here are just a few highlights from our analysis of these data. First, we find that Hispanic parents rate center-based care similarly to white and Black parents. Although not presented visually here just because of space, we find that a majority of Hispanic, white, and Black parents view centers favorably on preparing children for school and teaching children to get along with others. Also, as you can see in the middle of this graph, parents' ratings of centers in terms of safety and flexibility are similar across racial ethnic groups. The 2 group differences that we find are that Hispanics are less likely than white parents to perceive centers as affordable, which is shown by the set of bars on the left side of the graph, and Hispanic parents are less likely than Black parents to perceive centers as nurturing, shown by the set of bars on the right side of the graph. Some of the biggest racial ethnic differences and perceptions that we found were actually for relative care or family friend care. So whereas Hispanic and Black parents tended to rate home-based providers similarly across the dimensions, we see differences when we compare Hispanic parent perceptions to white parent perceptions. More specifically, Hispanic parents were significantly less likely than white parents to perceive family friend care as nurturing, safe, flexible, or affordable. Finally, a fourth household dimension that we wanted to talk about today that we've investigated is search and decision making. So we've been asking questions such as how many low-income Hispanic families report searching for ECE? What are their reasons for doing so? How many and what types of providers do they consider? And do their searches lead to new arrangements? To summarize these findings before showing you some of the numbers, we're finding that low-income Hispanic families are less likely to conduct an ECE search compared to their white and Black peers. However, they embark on ECE searches for similar reasons, primarily to support work and promote child development. Hispanic families consider fewer providers in their search than white and Black parents, and who they consider differs. More specifically, Hispanic parents were less likely than other parents to consider center-based care for infants and toddlers, but as likely to consider center-based care for preschoolers. And we're also finding that low-income Hispanic families are less likely than non-Hispanic families to change their ECE arrangement based on their search. So again, to show you what some of these findings look like, here we present the percentage of households that reported conducting an ECE search in the past 24 months for a target child under the age of 6. The gold bar on the right indicates that 41% of all low-income families reported a search, but the rate is 35% for Hispanic parents, represented by the orange bar, which is significantly lower than the nearly 50% of Black families that conducted a search. Along with being less likely to conduct a search, we find some evidence that Hispanic families may have more limited search experiences. So, for example, we find that Hispanic parents are less likely to consider multiple providers than white and Black parents, which is the set of bars on the left side. And they're less likely than Black parents to start using a new arrangement as a result of a search. So in some sense, these data do indicate that more than 50% of Hispanic and white parents who are seeking ECE experience an unsuccessful or unfulfilled search. However, we don't know from these particular data how many of these parents decided that they were happy with or preferred their current arrangement to alternatives considered during the search, versus the alternative explanation of were they able to find options at all. So to just summarize some of these findings from the household perspective, collectively our analysis of national and local data provides some new insights about household dimensions of Hispanic ECE access. Utilization patterns and parent perceptions are more similar than not across low-income Hispanic, white, and Black families. For example, we're seeing that centers are the predominant arrangement being used for children ages 3 to 5. And more specifically, our findings of relatively high rates of preschool attendance for Hispanic children in immigrant and dual language households, both in the national NSECE data, but also in the Chicago data that we've been looking at. We feel like this provides some evidence that hard to reach groups are being reached. At the same time, some of the analyses we've described today also suggest possible access barriers for Hispanics. For example, we're seeing lower ECE utilization for infants and toddlers compared to white and Black peers. Hispanic families are less likely to have relatives nearby who can provide childcare. We're seeing higher rates of weekend work and the experience of having short advance notice of work hours, and some evidence that ECE searches are more limited and less likely to result in a new arrangement. So now I'll turn it back over to Lina to describe work we've been doing that considers some of the supply side aspects of access.
Thanks, Danielle. So now I'd like to turn to the features and supply of ECE that the Hispanic Center has examined, what we found, and what this might mean for our understanding of Hispanic families' access to early care and education. For this work, we've developed a descriptive profiles that compare the features of access among high Hispanic serving providers to their low Hispanic serving counterparts. But first, just a quick overview of our findings. Overall, looking at the supply features of access, we find much promise, but also room for improvement. High Hispanic serving providers appear to be doing well on most predictors of quality, and we find that high Hispanic serving providers are ethnically and linguistically diverse with comparable levels of training and experience as their low Hispanic serving counterparts. We also see potential signs of a disconnect between what high Hispanic serving centers offer and the needs of Hispanic families, as the work that Danielle just described highlights. However, we also see some evidence that suggests that high Hispanic serving home-based providers may be stepping in to fill some of this gap. And finally, we see evidence that differences between high and low Hispanic serving providers may be due in part to funding, with high Hispanic serving providers more likely to receive public funding than their counterparts. So nationally, we see that more than 1 in 5, or roughly 1 in 5 of all ECE providers, including center and home-based providers, serve a high proportion of Hispanic children. And we define high Hispanic serving as providers where 25% or more of children enrolled are Hispanic. And we use 25% as the cutoff because, first, 25% of all children in the U.S. are Hispanic, and secondly, because a higher cutoff would result in inclusion of only providers that serve communities with a high density of Hispanics. So now let's turn to what we found when we looked at features of availability and flexibility, such as the timing and number of hours of care offered, flexibility in payment or care schedules, and reasons why providers may turn down caring for children. Of the 7 features of availability and flexibility that we examined, not all of which I'll highlight today, we found that high Hispanic serving centers were on par or performed worse than their low Hispanic serving counterparts on 5 of the 7 features. In contrast, high Hispanic serving listed home-based providers, and these are providers that are available on public lists, what we typically refer to as family childcare or formal home-based providers. They're doing either on par or better on all 7 features of availability and flexibility. In this slide, we look at the hours and schedules of care offered by the type of provider. So looking at the left-hand side of the graph, we see that under half of high Hispanic serving centers, depicted here in orange, offer full-time hours, and this is significantly lower than that of their low Hispanic serving counterparts. In contrast, the majority of high Hispanic serving listed home-based providers, and again, those are what we typically think of as family childcare providers, offer full-time care schedules. On the right-hand side, you can see that few high Hispanic serving providers of any kind, whether center or home-based, offer evening or weekend care, though the proportion does increase among home-based providers. In this next slide, we look at the features of flexibility, such as varying schedules, charging only for what care parents use, or charging for late pickup. And so 2 key points that I'd like to make here. First, as you can see from the first set of bars, roughly 1/3 of high Hispanic serving centers offer varying care schedules. This is lower than among their low Hispanic serving counterparts. In contrast, the majority of high Hispanic serving home-based providers, whether listed or unlisted, offer varying schedules. Moving to the second point and to the third set of bars, we find that many high Hispanic serving centers and listed home-based providers charge parents for late pickup. However, this is significantly lower than among their low Hispanic serving counterparts. In other words, both high Hispanic serving centers and listed home-based providers are less likely to charge fees for late pickup than their low Hispanic serving peers. So now moving on to the second supply feature of ECE Access, predictors of quality. Among the predictors of quality that we examined were staff coaching and mentoring, staff turnover, child-adult ratios, screening and family support services, and curriculum use. Overall, we found that high Hispanic serving centers either exceed or are on par in 5 of the 7 predictors of quality that we examined. So in this slide, we look at mentoring, coaching, and professional development offerings, as well as the use of curriculum in high Hispanic serving centers to that of low Hispanic serving counterparts. We find that high Hispanic serving centers are more likely to offer mentoring and coaching, as seen in the first set of bars, and to use a curriculum, as seen in the last set of bars. They're as likely to provide professional development funds or time as their low Hispanic serving counterparts, and that's seen in the middle set of bars. In this slide, we see that high Hispanic serving centers are more likely to offer screenings and family support services than their low Hispanic serving counterparts. For example, moving from left to right on this graph, we see that high Hispanic serving centers are more likely to offer health screenings, developmental assessments, therapy, counseling, and to have a specialist on staff. So last, we're examining 3 aspects of ECE workforce: ethnic and linguistic diversity, education, training, and experience. And a brief based on these findings is going to be released later this summer. So as you can see in this slide, we found that those working in high Hispanic serving centers are more ethnically and linguistically diverse. For example, roughly half of high Hispanic serving centers have staff who are themselves Hispanic, and the majority of high Hispanic serving home-based providers also are themselves Hispanic. In this slide, we see that the majority of providers working in high Hispanic serving centers have a CDA or state certificate, and that this is higher than among their low Hispanic serving counterparts. And we also see that many listed home-based providers serving a large proportion of Hispanic children also have a CDA. And finally, in this slide, we see that a significantly higher proportion of staff in high Hispanic serving centers have majored either in early care and education or more broadly in education than staff in low Hispanic serving centers. So what does this all mean? Together, we think that the work of the center and others provides a contemporary portrait of Hispanic families' access to early care and education, and, as Danielle mentioned, a new narrative. First, we see evidence that gaps in ECE use between Hispanic and non-Hispanic children appear to be closing, and these gaps are especially narrowing among preschoolers. Yet, they continue, or at least the evidence suggests that they continue to persist among infants and toddlers. Second, we see new evidence that challenges previously suggested reasons for lower ECE participation rates among Hispanics. Compared to low-income white and Black parents, low-income Hispanic parents hold similar perceptions regarding center care. They begin searches for similar reasons, and they're no more likely to prefer or to use relative care if they're using non-parental care. In short, in more ways than not, low-income Hispanic parents look very similar to low-income white and Black parents. We also see some evidence that traditionally hard-to-reach groups, such as immigrants or Spanish speakers, are being reached. We see this in the local data, and we see this in the national data. For example, in Chicago, we found that participation in public early care and education programs among Hispanics is higher among Spanish-speaking and immigrant households. We also find that centers that serve a large proportion of Hispanic children are faring somewhat well, or are faring well on predictors of quality, workforce diversity, and training and experience, and that public funding may be playing a role in this. Still, we see room for improvements and signs of unmet need. Hispanic families have more narrow searches. They're more likely to start a search and that search not lead to a switch in provider. Again, it's not clear what this necessarily means, but it suggests a possible unmet need. And it's also unclear how well centers are meeting the needs of low-income working parents. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Yvette, who's going to offer some reflections on what these findings mean for program and policies. Yvette?
Great. Thanks, Lina. First off, I just want to thank Mike, Danielle, the center, and SRCD for this opportunity. So This research is really incredible. I would start by just saying that I think we've come a long way just in the last decade in understanding both the complexity but the similarities of Latinos and Black and white and other race and ethnicities in this country. The thing that has become most interesting to me as I've been looking at this research over just the last couple of days really is the similarities that have come up. So I really appreciate both Danielle and Lina focusing on talking about how similar low-income families are across the country, and especially going back to Lina's phrase around a contemporary portrait of Latinos today. As it relates specifically to policy, it's a really interesting time in this country right now. We know that there is a shift in the demographics with regards to Latinos, particularly young Latinos. And we all know that this is going to have a long-term impact on the economic outcomes of local communities, but most importantly of this country as a whole. And so as we, Childcare Aware of America, but I think also other national partners are really considering all of the policy implications, what we're really starting to find and what this research really helps to do is to elevate that all of the pieces that we're pushing for in terms of quality, access, affordability, and ultimately meeting the needs of families, and particularly Latino families, are critical. There are several potential policy opportunities in the coming future. We just had a huge increase to the Child Care Development Block Grant along with Head Start, which we know is going to have a huge impact on how local providers, both center-based and home-based, will be serving families, particularly thinking about Latino and Hispanic families in their communities, and making sure that with all of that public funding, they are meeting the needs of families, particularly as they are being held accountable by these federal offices. So it's not a surprise that within our early childhood settings, we are finding more staff and teachers at all levels that look like the families that they're serving, that folks are able to talk with families in the language that is helpful to them, and particularly that staff are also getting the professional development they need. Obviously, we still have a much longer way to go, but we're slowly getting there. There are some cautions though, right? Again, we're in a really interesting time, particularly as we think about immigrants and as we think about the rhetoric around Latinos in the United States. So this research is particularly important so that we are getting a clear picture and we're getting a real picture of what our families look like, and particularly what our young children look like. The fact that the majority of these kids are US born and they have at least one parent who is also a citizen is critical as we're thinking about what kind of services families need. The thing that surprises me about this research is that while high Hispanic serving early childhood settings are doing a fairly good job when compared to other settings, it's interesting that folks are still struggling with trying to meet the needs of families. And I wonder, though, if that's just a larger question around how our local services or our state services are really meeting the needs of low-income families in particular, but also in general. We know that families are struggling with infant and toddler care. We know that families and communities are struggling with non-traditional working hours, so working in the evenings, working multiple shifts, working on weekends. And we know that families are struggling with not having extended family or relatives close by, right? So all of those pieces are critical as we are thinking about our federal policies. We've seen some, noise this past week around SNAP with the passing of the Farm Bill, but also some noise around a possibility of TANF, as well as I think many have heard a possibility on an immigration bill this coming week. So for me, it's critically important to make sure that with all of the policy that we are doing, particularly as Latinos for Latinos, that we're using the research that represents a contemporary and a real portrait of what our young children and our families need. And I would just really end by saying that a couple of things that are important is obviously continuing that translation from the research to the policy and the practice. As someone who has been in the field for quite some time, but also able to see this at both the local, the state, and the federal level, these pieces are really critical because we know that if we just pass policies that don't have any good data behind them, we're not really sure what's going to happen at the local level. But then it's critical that we take into account what local providers and families are saying that they need so that we're not inadvertently passing policies that impact them in a negative way. Improving dissemination. I'm not sure how many folks are on this, but I would just really keep pushing for making sure that the data is getting out and that it's getting out beyond the choir. So we often spend our time talking to each other in all of this. So really pushing us all to think about how do we get this information and this data and have a real practical discussion about what the demographics look like in this country, how Latinos impact that, and particularly how young Latino children and their families impact all of that. And then ultimately, I think for me, and I think both Mike and Lina have heard me say this for a long time, we've come a long way in our research for Latino families and understanding how they use early childhood education. One of the things I think that we have to continue to push and strive for is a long-term study that helps us to really understand the long-term positive impacts of early childhood education on our Latino families and ultimately how that impacts local and our national economy. And so with that, I will stop and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Yvette. Really good comments. We have, I know we have a number of questions that people have submitted, and encourage you to submit questions as you come in. But let me start things off because Yvette, a couple of things that you said really highlighted some of the issues that have emerged from this work that we've been doing, and part of that is the policy relevance and not just doing this work for the sake of doing it, but doing work that's going to have some real impact on policy, both at the federal and state level. So I think the first question that I'd like to throw out, I mean, I have my own thoughts on this, but I'll throw it out to the three of you. So we went over a lot of different findings today, a lot of different issues. And so of those, what are, given if you're a state policymaker out there, what are the one or two clearest take-home messages that you would want state policymakers to have if you want them to follow Yvette's guidance in improving access to ECE for low-income families, particularly the rapidly growing Hispanic population? What would be the one or two take-home messages out of all these different things? Because there's a lot here. I don't know, Danielle, Lina?
This is Lina, and I'd love to hear Yvette's thoughts on this, but I think I have two that I would pick, and one is definitely this potential mismatch between the needs of low-income working families, in particular the work that Danielle has shown that, the typical low-income child and child household is a household with parents who are working non-standard hours, with the majority of them either, a high proportion already have parents who are at work before 6 a.m. or have weekend and evening hours, and this is particularly true, the weekend part is particularly true for Hispanic child households. And how do we better how does public policy and public investment in early care and education, in particular childcare subsidies, how does that help to better meet the needs of working families? So that would be the first one. And then the second one is, I think, more of a good news story, the potential that I think the work of the center in Chicago really helped to illustrate that if there is a very intentional and concerted effort that helps to blend funding streams and multiple players are at the same table with the same goals, that it is very much possible to reach the hardest to reach populations. So immigrant groups, recent arrivals, and non-English speakers typically tend to be some of the hardest to reach groups. But it is possible if it's an intentional and concerted effort at all levels of government.
Great. Danielle or Yvette, would you like to build on that?
I would really echo. Go ahead, Yvette.
Go ahead, Danielle. I talked plenty.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to, as Lina was speaking of, I was going to echo some of those same findings. So, for example, with the non-standard hours, there's the opportunity there with the new CCDF in terms of an increased focus on trying to increase the supply of care during non-traditional hours. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what states are doing in that area, because, we're seeing in our data that, of course, parents are looking for ECE arrangements that can support work, but they're also looking to promote child development and help prepare their children for school and have settings that provide nurturance. And so I think figuring out how to do that with some of these scheduling issues, because I think sometimes that can mean that, for example, can families take advantage of some of the publicly funded early education opportunities that are available that might be taking place when they're not working, but then still needing to blend that with care for while they are working. So I think it's going to be critical to find ways to do that. And we'll see. It seems like there's some opportunity and some more recognition in terms of our policy and funding, but we'll have to see kind of how it plays out.
Great. Yvette, I have another question for you that I think that will resonate with your former role within Head Start. And it's the notion that for many years we've seen around culturally based preferences for either Latinos not having their children in care, or if they have them in care, having them in family-based childcare versus center-based care. That's been kind of the prevalent narrative. And I think, as both Lina and Danielle touched upon, some of these findings really seem to be shifting that narrative a bit. So when you think about the differences, the age differences, some of what Danielle talked about were that while we see fewer differences in utilization rates for preschool age kids, we still see some lower rates for infants and toddlers. And so there may still, while the overall narrative seems to be shifting, that it's not necessarily driven totally by culturally based preference, that there may still be something in play for infants and toddlers. Maybe you can speak to that in terms of early Head Start and the focus on infants and toddlers there.
Yeah, sure. So I think that this infant and toddler piece, so I was actually going to use that to answer your previous question too about policymakers. And I think really what I have learned through all the research that the center has done and that you all have individually done is that while we're getting a real picture of what Latino families prefer and how and why they access certain types of care, the piece around infants and toddlers is fascinating because it's not a piece that only affects Latino families. We know across the board that all families are struggling with infant and toddler care. And so as I am thinking about how I want to approach policymakers around all of these pieces, right? Policymakers love data and they love research, but the trick here is translating the research into something that makes sense for them within their local communities. And so, well, I think that there are still going to be very unique aspects to infant and toddler care for Latino families. I think it is something that we can raise within this issue of the lack of quality, affordable infant and toddler care across the country. I also just want to speak really quickly to the first point that Lina brought up around blending funding streams. I think at the local level, folks are the most innovative when it comes to thinking about how to meet the needs of families. And at the federal and at the state level, we're really trying to think about what are the policies that need to move forward in order to make sure that we're making some progress. But it's really folks at the local level who take those policies and maybe like go to the edge of the cliff, but they don't jump over because they know that they still have to be held accountable, right? So we know through policy, we've been able to get more Hispanic teachers and directors and staff into ECE. They have higher degrees. We know that we've got, you know, ECE settings really thinking about language and culture. And now they're going to like take it to the next level, right? Around thinking about how do they use their funding and their resources to really start to meet the needs of the families that they serve in their local communities, particularly if they're Latinos.
Great. Well, and here's a follow-up question that just came in that's relevant to this policy discussion. What are the challenges in developing and implementing policies to meet low-income Latino families' needs? You know, you touched on some of those, Yvette, but you know, when people think about it, they often think about it in isolation. But what are the biggest challenges to really influence the policy decision-making process?
I mean, I would say that at this moment, obviously, it's the rhetoric, right, that we're all dealing with as it relates to immigration. And that's a really tough piece to try to get people to see beyond. So again, for me, it's like going back to the data, right? The data, the first pieces of data that Lina showed around the increasing US-born Latinos, thinking about the demographics in this country, like who's going to be, you know, filling the jobs, who's going to be taking care of us when we retire, who's going to be teaching our kids, who's going to be our doctors. But the biggest challenge is like getting past the rhetoric. And I think that what we do is we use the data to say, like, look at this data, right? All this swirling noise that you're hearing, that's not really what's happening. Think about this data. Think about the local communities that policymakers have to go back to and be accountable to, so that, you know, they can keep their jobs too. So I think for us, it's dealing with rhetoric right now, but then we counter that by using the data that you all do on a, you know, on a daily basis.
Well, but and moving away from, you know, the political discourse and looking at, you know, what does childcare represent? What does ECE represent? You know, there's been an ongoing conversation and debate about, is it first and foremost about child development, or is it about work support for parents?
Mm-hmm.
I think some of what Danielle presented on the findings, which I think are some of the most interesting findings around non-standard work hours, and Lina articulated that as well. You know, that gets at the flexibility of scheduling for parents. Yep. The very real needs, because having, as a parent who has paid late fees several times when my kids were younger, it's hard enough for me having a regular job. But when you have the things that Danielle talked about in terms of unpredictable work hours, non-standard work hours, et cetera, how do we wrap our heads around, you know, childcare as a work support, which I think everyone can agree it's an important aspect of parents being able to work. So it's separate from the child development side. So you know, that seems to be a big factor that worth considering.
Yeah, I would just say that so from where I sit, and I think where many early childhood folks sit, right, it's both. It's both the comprehensive development of kids and families, and in that, it's the work supports of the family. So if you're going to be talking about early childhood, we're going to be talking about all the needs of the family, right? From like making sure that we have good teachers in our centers to making sure that the hours are flexible enough for families to be able to go to work, but then at the same time, making sure that we're supporting the health needs of families when they're coming into our early childhood settings. And you know what? And if families' situations change, that we have the capacity and the flexibility to be able to support that. Because in the long term, we ultimately support our kids and our families and communities as they move up into public schools or, you know, K through 12 schools and then beyond that.
Great. So turning back to Lina and Danielle, because we've talked a lot about the policy implications, which is part of the reason why we do the work that we're doing. But when you looking forward, based on all the work that we talked about today and all the other work that we've done at the center and that other people have done in this area, what are the most critical research gaps that, you know, whether it's us at the center or other people, that we think would be important to be addressing to kind of continue to move this knowledge base forward? Where are the biggest gaps that we all need to struggle with? Lina, Danielle? Lina, maybe you start.
Yeah, I'm trying to prioritize them as I think through.
Okay, the top 10.
So one is definitely, I think we've already touched on some of these. One is definitely the infant and toddler space. That I think we are getting a good handle on what's happening in the preschool space, but we probably need to, you know, to devote similar levels of effort and energy to understanding the infant and toddler space. And I think also similar to this is understanding some of the unintended consequences of policies at the local level and understanding how that may result in changes for moving, for example, workforce that was previously in the infant and toddler space to the preschool space or so forth. So we need to think about that, or moving a workforce that was in the home-based space, that moving it into you know, public pre-K, for example. So we need to think about those unintended consequences, and there's some really great work already happening in that area, but that's something that needs to be constantly refreshed. And then the other is, I think, also really understanding, and this is one of the places where the National Survey of Early Care and Education really does an excellent job, is understanding that interplay between the household characteristics and preferences and behaviors, and that interplay between the household level and sort of the local community and supply issues. So better understanding the interplay, I think, is the other one. And I'll just go with a fourth. And that I think one of the things that we've also tried to do at the center, and others are doing as well, is understanding that incredible Hispanics, you know, is a very broad term that includes many people and they vary in terms of their country of origin, their language, their you know, legal status in the U.S., what have you, their duration, and really understanding what that means in terms of access, not only to early care and education, but access to different social services and to the labor market and education, I think, is another priority for me.
Great, thanks. Danielle, why don't you get one quick thought, and then we're going to do closing comments.
Yes. Well, I think Lina provided a great list. In fact, right before her fourth point, that was the only thing I could think of adding. So, in terms of just the heterogeneity, I know it's been important that we keep returning to that in our own center work, as even though here we're providing kind of this national picture and using the pan-ethnic category of Hispanic, we also recognize all the heterogeneity within that, and the need to better understand what are the various, you know, kind of storylines and lived experiences of Latino families. And I think, as Lina pointed out, some of how that varies across communities. So, you know, as we've talked about at the center too, thinking about more established communities that have a history of, for example, having immigrants within the community versus what are the experiences of Hispanic families in states that are either newer destination states or where the demographics are changing, not just around immigration, but just where the demographics are changing.
Great. Well, thanks. I want to final thoughts before I turn it back over to Patricia to close us out. But I think that you know, across all of what you heard today, you know, a lot of really interesting findings, and the fact that there's no one size fits all to this. And I think the last points that Lina and Danielle were stressing around the heterogeneity of the Latino population is really important. That these findings are pushing the field in a positive direction, in much in the way that they talked about, but that there's a lot of variability within the Latino population that we have to keep in mind as moving forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Patricia to close us out. But thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you again to everyone who joined us today, especially thank you to all of our speakers for such a thought-provoking presentation. If you enjoyed today's webinar, you may be interested in future consortium webinars. While this is the final webinar of the 2017-2018 series, the 2018-2019 webinar series will begin in the fall. So you can see the information on this slide if you're interested in helping plan a webinar in the upcoming year, and keep an eye out in the fall for announcements about upcoming webinars. You can also join the consortium listserv to receive notifications about future webinars, a quarterly newsletter, as well as job and event announcements. As I noted earlier, I will be sending a follow-up email around to all participants, and I will attach a copy of the slides from today, as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.